Well, the ATACMS is basically a long-range precision-guided missile. These have sort of been around for a while, but have very much come to the fore in the Ukraine war. The challenge being that it's designated as an artillery piece, but a smart artillery piece. And the challenge has been for either side to be able to hit targets with accuracy. So what is really important as far as the Ukrainians go, they've had ATACMS for some while, but they've only had the short range ones, sort of 30, 40 miles or so. But the ability to attack military targets into Russia behind the lines, particularly the logistics that are supplying all the supplies to the front line, is hugely significant. And this is where ATACMS comes in. This is where they're really good. And the ATACMS that we understand that the Ukrainians now have from the Americans are the more advanced, the more modern ones, the much longer range ones, and also in quantity. So what we're hearing over the last sort of 24 hours from the Ukrainians themselves, but certainly not denied by the Allies, that they're using these ATACMS to go deep into Russia, up to 200 miles, to interdict key Russian military targets. And the inference that they have enough of these to make an impact. And we've seen how actually the deep Ukrainian strikes are having a massive effect on mainly the Russian economy, because they've been attacking the oil industry, particularly the petrol refining industry, and that's cut off the supply of money, of foreign currency that Putin so badly needs. But the ability to also wear down and grind down his military is hugely important. We've seen Russia has massed about 170,000 troops in the Donbass for the assault on Petrovsk. But had the Ukrainians had these missiles, say, a few months ago, they could have affected and disrupted the buildup of those troops. So now that they can do that, a similar operation like Petrovsk will be very difficult. So it's clear. And the fact, I think, there's a psychological impact too. Now that the Russians know that anything within 200 miles of the border, the sort of 800-mile contact line, as we call it, is well within range of Ukrainian ATACMS missiles, then that makes a huge difference. And I think the other element to that, Ukraine has been using some of its very valuable longer range missiles, the Poseidon and others that Ukraine has developed themselves, which means that they can now use them at much greater length rather than focusing on targets closer to the Ukraine border. So I think overall this probably has a very positive effect on the Ukrainian military. And as far as the Russians go, it constricts their what we call freedom of maneuver. The key thing on the battlefield is to be able to have freedom of maneuver, go where you like and attack where you like. If you don't have that, life becomes very much more difficult. And I think hitherto, Russia has had more freedom of maneuver than Ukraine and the Allies would like. And if the ATACMS, this new ATACMS, are there in sufficient strength, then that'll be a real big headache for the Russians, I expect. Well, I think we have to, in this particular war, which is being controlled by propaganda and disinformation, it's very difficult to actually get a really clear picture. So, of course, one would expect the Russians to say they're dealing with them, they're intercepting them. And I wouldn't take that at face value. I think the fact that the Russians have shouted so loudly about ATACMS and about cruise missiles means that actually they're having a much bigger impact than the Russians want to admit. And part of that is what we're hearing at the moment. So we haven't seen the full battle damage assessment from the Ukrainians or from the Allies, but if the Russians are shouting about it and say it's not working, generally that is usually about 180 degrees from what's actually happening. So yeah, I think ATACMS are a real concern for the Russians and a real bonus for the Ukrainians. Well, we're hoping it's a really significant shift. Trump in particular has been very quiet over the last few weeks and perhaps months. We had the much vaunted summit in Alaska. We had a council meeting in Budapest, where Trump and Putin were supposed to meet to discuss a ceasefire. It would appear that Trump has now realized that Putin has sort of been playing him, and Putin has no interest in peace. And Trump has got increasingly frustrated. And it would appear, and I think, his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, has also got frustrated with the Russians too. I think these guys sort of thought that they could drag Putin to a peace table, have a nice peace, not spend too much US money or munitions, and it would be all happy. And Trump could declare the eighth war or ninth war that he'd stopped this year, and the Nobel Peace Prize would be sitting on the White House before you could say sort of boo to a goose. Now, that appears, at least now, that Trump has realized that's not the case. And the only way to get a peace is to make sure that Ukraine can prevail. So there have been a number of indicators, a number of visits to Kyiv recently, and I think the ATACMS knowledge is a very significant shift in direction. Undoubtedly, the Europeans, nations, including the Brits, are probably paying for these ATACMS missiles, but that's fine. That is a key weaponry that the Ukrainians need. The natural next step would be the cruise missiles, the Tomahawk missiles that Ukraine so badly craves and badly needs. Now, if Putin saw Trump gifting those to the Ukrainians or giving them via the Europeans, then that would be a signal to the Kremlin and to Putin that the tide had very much changed. I think they really need to apply it to targets that will resonate to the rank and file in Russian, to the Russian people, because at the moment the Russian people are pretty much ignorant of really what's happening. They now realise that the price of their petrol is very high if they can get it at all. Whether they actually realise that's because their oil industry has been attacked so badly, who knows? It's very difficult to judge. Trump did a few months ago ask Zelensky whether he would put a cruise missile through the Kremlin. Now, what impact or effect Trump was trying to have there, who knows? But it's pretty clear that that actually it's the Russian people who are now beginning to realize that this special military operation is no great liberation for them. And people are beginning to question, eventually Putin's leadership, who might potentially take over from Putin. And these are the sort of things that could perpetuate that. And there are an awful lot of people saying whoever will take over from Putin might be worse. Well, he might be, but all the people sort of ganging up in the Kremlin wanting to take over are the sort of oligarchs and the super rich who are getting frustrated that they can't go to their villas and super yachts in the Mediterranean and ski chalets in Switzerland. And actually, if they did take power, they might be more interested in wallowing in their luxuries in Europe rather than continue to fight the Ukrainians.